Hello, this is Craig Camp, and welcome to a special edition of the Troon Talk Podcast, recorded during the National Biodynamic Conference in Westminster, Colorado this November. Please excuse the quality of these recordings made during the conference in public places using Bluetooth microphones. However, I am sure you will find the content more than worthwhile. The first segment is a discussion between Dr. Lynne Carpenter-Boggs, a professor of soil science and chair of crop and soil sciences at Washington State University, and Troon Vineyard's director of agriculture, Garett Long. Her research and teaching have included soil microbiology, alternative agricultural systems, and composting. Her work often bridges the gap between biodynamic grower observations and scientific principles. In our second segment, we present Garett's keynote address at the end of the conference that focused on the future of biodynamics 100 years after Rudolf Steiner gave the agricultural lectures that formed the foundations of biodynamic and organic agriculture. The conference was exciting, bringing together an incredibly diverse range of biodynamic farmers. As the conference was interrupted by COVID, this is the first time the community has been able to gather since 2018. It is always an amazing opportunity to discuss the challenges of farming biodynamically with other farmers. I am sure you'll find this podcast episode full of interesting insights into biodynamics.
My name is Garett Long. I'm the Director of Agriculture at Troon Vineyard, and we are at the annual Biodynamic Conference in Westminster, Colorado. And I'm joined today by Washington State University Professor of Soil Science, Lynne Carpenter-Boggs. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Garett. Great to be here.
Lynne, can you start out by telling us how did you get into researching biodynamics? This is a really unique thing for a professor at a land-grant university to involve biodynamics in her research career. How did you get into that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Most of what I do now isn't explicitly about biodynamics. It is, but it's almost all about how does life work with more life in agriculture. But I got into biodynamics work very explicitly in my during my PhD, and I had first heard about biodynamics in the early 90s, and was curious about it during my master's degree, and I couldn't find anybody who would even talk to me about it at that time. And so I, just learned some things on the side. And as I was funding my work for my master's degree, I luckily got a fellowship. And I figured out that I could squirrel away a lot of my money and finish up the work that I said I was going to do and then do what I wanted. And so I was planning to do that, or hoping to do that, and some folks at the university I was at, I don't want to incriminate anybody unnecessarily, but these people brought in Fred Kirschenman.
Mm-hmm. He's a real skeptic of biodynamics.
Oh, no. You're thinking, I don't remember his name. Kirschman. Yeah, no, Fred Kirschenman. He headed the Leopold Institute for many years in Iowa, but he was also a biodynamic farmer, and I happen to know about Fred because he was a huge biodynamic farmer, but he's also a philosopher, and so he was brought into my university to talk about paradigm shifts in agriculture and how new ideas take hold. And it was a fascinating talk. Nowhere in it did he say the word biodynamic. And but after the talk, a few of us went to a different room and were just having a conversation, and he kind of let slip that he practiced biodynamics on his farm. And I happened to be on the opposite side of the table from Fred. And when he said biodynamics, I saw every head in the room swivel to look at him and say, what is that? tell us more. And a few people had heard of it, and they were like, oh, I can't believe you do this. And it showed me that people were hungry for that information. Mm. And whereas I had been curious about it before, then I knew I had to find a way to pursue that, because people were really hungry for it, and it's very difficult to find the funds and resources to ask those questions.
Yeah.
So I did it because I had to.
And the folks in the room with the head swivel, these are professors, these are deans. Who is so hungry for more?
Right, professors, USDA scientists, graduate students. Yeah.
And I also came across your work through John Reganold as well, who is another now professor emeritus from Washington State, and he's done quite a bit of research himself around biodynamics. And I associate the two of you for that reason, that unique quality that you've both brought that into your research lab. I wonder, is there something about Wazoo, about Washington State University, what is their perspective on biodynamics?
Right. Well, again, we don't talk about it much. I have one lecture in one of my classes that I do about biodynamics, and it's introduced in several classes as just another type of alternative ag. But it's not just myself and John, who's emeritus in another 6 weeks. But
excuse me, thank you.
But also Walter Goldstein did his PhD at WSU in the 80s. And
really?
he wasn't explicitly biodynamic at that point, but certainly is one of the most important U.S. biodynamic researchers since then. And so I'm not sure why. There have been a few key people who've just been open. There's also very important work from Bob Papendick, who is with the USDA ARS. He wrote he led a group that researched organic agriculture and just expose this organic agriculture as something that actually might make sense.
Yeah.
That was kind of shocking to the rest of the USDA.
Which hopefully the trend is moved away from that these days, and there's much more acceptance and advocacy around organics, but this was a different time.
At least acceptance.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's still...
Don't take it too far.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, given this history, and Jennifer Reeve also came through Washington State and has her own research lab.
Right, exactly.
Utah or Utah State?
Utah State.
Yeah. And so there's this little hub almost, if I may, of biodynamic research coming out of Wazoo. At the higher levels, what is the reaction to this kind of
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been fascinating. One of the very important things I learned doing that work was that everybody's biased. And science is supposed to be non-biased, but it's not always. And many times the people who scream the loudest about ideals like that are following them the least. So lots of scientists are biased against biodynamics or anything that is too far out of the ordinary. But at the same time, it's kind of like talking to anybody that you're not already their best friend. You try to find common language.
Yeah.
You try to speak someone else's language and find the things that are important to them and express what's important to you in a way that's also important to them. So biodynamics is, at least some aspects of biodynamics are researchable, and it's the kinds of questions that you ask about it and how you go about trying to answer those questions.
Yeah.
And it's been really interesting because that kind of approach, you know, I think of it as like, oh, trying to bridge this, but it also tends to really annoy people on both sides, because then you find that, you know, many times I'm really annoying to the hardcore biodynamic people because I don't find that the preparations change the world overnight. And I'm really annoying to what's, you know, considered conventional agricultural scientists, because I'm even asking these questions.
Yeah.
You know, that's annoying. So I figure, you know, if I annoy a lot of people in the room equally, then I'm probably about in the right place.
Yeah.
But you know, then I'm not alone in that idea. You know, lots of people are seeing that, okay, there are lots of interesting things that people are doing, trying, and as long as we are willing to look at things objectively, take measures, make hypotheses, these things are approachable.
Yeah.
And we can have a sane conversation about things that work or don't work.
So let's dig into that a little bit more. I find myself, when I think about biodynamic research, thinking about the importance of looking to the future, and just doing good science is starting with a good research question and formulating a hypothesis around that is testable. How can we measure this? How can we quantify this, right? And so can you walk us through how you've formulated some of your research in the past to be able to actually test it, and what are some of those metrics that you're using to analyze, for example, the effects of preparations on compost formation and that sort of thing? Let's talk about the scientific process and the questions that we ask.
Mm-hmm. Right. And the questions that we're able to ask definitely change over time too, depending on what tools we have. Mm. So you know, the compost work, you know, we're primarily asking just, is there a difference between compost that's developed using the biodynamic preparations and method and compost that develops from the same feedstocks in the same place, but not using the preparations. So the methods that were used to assess that in terms of what I could gather data about were things like tracking the temperature, microbial activities at various time points during the composting process. We're doing phospholipid microbial community comparisons. Yeah, so several different kind of enzyme activities, and nitrate formation, which is an indicator of kind of late stage compost maturity.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, same kind of things that anybody would ask about. Yeah, how compost is developing, and then we asked, all right, do these behave differently once we add them to the soil, and do the plants perform differently? So, you know, then we brought those composts out to field plots, you know, well replicated and all of that, and 2 different sites and full years, and you know, measuring plant performance, weed populations, yields, again, kind of standard agronomic measures.
Yeah, yeah. And what were your results of that composting study, briefly? Did you find differences between the 2 different methodologies?
Yes, yeah. So what's commonly been, we found what's commonly been found about biodynamic compost is that it's a little bit warmer, or it stays warmer a bit longer. Mm. You know, we really weren't finding huge temperature differences, but consistent. And a bit higher activity levels during the composting process, and that the biodynamic compost also was a bit mature faster.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, not huge differences. And once we put those out onto land, what we were seeing is that most agricultural soils are really hungry for carbon and compost and organic materials. And the reaction to any kind of compost is so great that the difference you'll see, at least in the short term, between biodynamic and non-biodynamic compost is very, very small.
Yeah.
What the land really wants is that compost in any way it can get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that was a disappointing result for the hardcore biodynamic practitioners.
Exactly. Yeah. And I can understand part of that, and I hear that. Well, of course, you're limited to a couple of years study, and you won't see your results, and that may very well be. There are definitely limitations in, the way a lot of ag studies are funded. And again, I was like doing things on a shoestring, and but all this money I had squirreled away from other things. So it was by necessity, a lot of short-term things.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in doing more projects in the future with producers who have been using methods for longer term. But then you get into other kinds of problems wherein you don't have proper controls or comparisons of things. So
these are always challenges of conducting on-farm research.
Right.
One, getting the cooperation of the growers to uphold your research methodologies, and two,
don't harvest before you get my data, please.
Yes. Well, I'm interested to talk about the significance of those results as well. I understand that it may have been disappointing to biodynamic practitioners that were hoping for more of a subtle change, but you told me a great story yesterday about maybe who your results were significant to.
Right. And so in order to publish a study, and in order for it to be, to fit into the scientific paradigm and be, refereed and accepted, we go through a process of randomization and collecting data and applying statistics to it, and it's quite a high bar, just mathematically, to be able to tell the difference between treatments. They need to be very reliably different, and replicable and repeatable.
Yeah.
And but not everything that's important fits into that. And yeah, I had a beautiful, completely non-replicable experience doing that composting work. So the way things were set up, I would have one pile of composting feedstocks that was treated with the BD preps, and one of the same feedstock, same size of pile, right next to it. It was not treated with the preps. And I would go out there every few days and take my temperature readings and take samples, and did this over many months. Had these pairs of the compost piles. So, and that included doing this over a winter. So for several months I would go out there, and there was snow on the ground, but these composting piles were hot inside. And I started noticing that the biodynamic pile was just warm enough, just a few degrees warmer, and maybe the temperature was distributed a little bit differently, but the BD piles didn't have snow on top, and the non-BD piles were warm inside, but they would have snow on top. And I started noticing that there was this fox coming around from the tops of trees half a mile away, and the fox had figured out that it could go on top of the biodynamic compost pile, and it was warm and there was no snow there. And so then every time I would go out there and there was snow on the ground, I would see these fox tracks going on top of the BD pile. And so that's why we can talk about things that are biologically significant versus what's statistically significant, and things that are replicable and things that are non-replicable, but may be very, very important. So, to that fox, this is one individual organism that has a binary choice.
Yeah.
And it made that choice.
Consistently.
Consistently, right. Maybe that's how I could have taken data on it, was the consistency of the choice. I don't know. But I talk about, well, is that 2-degree temperature really biologically significant? You can argue, well, maybe it's not, but what does the fox say? The fox said that it was significant to that fox.
Yeah. So what do you make of that? It sounds like, if I'm to interpret that science is as we know it in this rigorous quantitative measure, that science may be missing out on something that is important because it doesn't follow the exact rules of a peer-reviewed journal, right? What might we be missing? What opportunities do we have, especially in the realm of biodynamic research, to explore these maybe more challenging or maybe even impossible to test hypotheses?
Yeah, and I don't think that problem is unique to biodynamic work. I think that it's really just an evolution of science and of human observation. We're getting more fine and more fine abilities of observation and measurement of all kinds of things. So, I don't necessarily think it's like a permanent limitation of things that's any different than the fact that people who don't approach things scientifically are also limited in the ways that they can understand things. It's evolution, but I do think that the time is more and more ripe for coevolution of that. So what are the things that we're observing that seem to be important, and can we measure that, and are we certain about what we think we're seeing? That's how it comes together.
Yeah. One example I think of in our own farming practices at Troon is we have guests who've been wine club members for many years, and they come back. We've been in this 5-year transition using biodynamic and regenerative practices, and they come back to the tasting room, and they're sitting in the garden during the summer months, and they'll comment on the noise of the birds. They'll comment on just the vitality and the life, the amount of insect life. They'll walk out to our native plant garden that's just steps from the tasting room and comment about just the buzz of energy around that. And it seems that would be a biologically significant result, but it is also measurable. We can go out there and we can do surveys, bird surveys, insect surveys, plant surveys. We can count diversity of species, abundance, and we can quantify that. And so I think that's an interesting example of how we actually can measure something that is perceptible and maybe different about a biodynamic farm. And if you were to just ask the general question of, well, what about a biodynamic farm is attracting all these birds, that's maybe not the right question, but we can quantify the number of birds.
Right. Yeah, and yet, that may not have been an initial question. You don't necessarily set out to do biodynamic farming so that you can have more birds. But it's something that once you start doing it and are established into it, you see that effect.
Yeah.
And then, as you see that consistently, you want to know, like, is that real? Like, are other farms experiencing that? And can we quantify that? And then we should be able to.
Yeah. I think that's so important as we look to the future to, these, as you just pointed out, there are observations we can make that lead to more research questions, right? And I think all of us as researchers and scientists understand that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We're building off of all of the work that has come before. And if we can make novel observations on a biodynamic farm or in our own research, it leads to new novel questions. And hopefully the interventions or new tools might lead to novel ways of testing those new questions. So as we look to the future, either in your own research at Washington State or just within the wider biodynamic community, what do you see as those important questions? What do you see as those potentially novel tools that we might use?
Right. Well, in the world of science that I know a bit more about, I'm a soil scientist and know more about the fertility and microbiology side. And there have been real advancements in how we can assess microbial communities. And there's been, with that too, there's continuing evolution. And we are moving from a time when we could kind of see things with watercolors to a time when we can make pixelated pictures, but not understand what the whole picture means.
Yeah, yeah.
And but we have a whole lot of pixels, and so now it's moving toward really deciphering what each of those pixels means.
Yeah.
So that is an exciting area. And I was just talking with like Walter Goldstein about the possibility of doing DNA-based microbial assessments on some of the work that he's doing with very, very interesting corn varieties he's developing.
Yeah.
And the communities that associate with those. And I think that there are a lot more researchers who are interested in the kinds of molecular signaling between organisms of various kinds, between plants and insects, plants and birds, insects and birds, insect to insect, pathogen to endophyte. So the communications.
Yeah.
I think that's an amazing area.
It seems like
research.
There's loads of questions we could ask given these new genomic and DNA sequencing techniques that are evolving very rapidly, right? And our ability to interpret what I understand to be just huge data sets, requiring a huge amount of analytical technology. What are some of those applications? You talked about maybe testing. What are the microbial relationships in Walter's corn, for example?
Well, that's kind of his story to tell, and I hope that maybe you ask him some of those questions.
Sure. Okay, well, maybe a more fair question.
So something I'm working on. So I've been playing with compost teas for some years, and this is again something that most researchers will kind of roll their eyes at, and for good reason. Like there's been way too much hype and misinformation. And wishful thinking around compost teas, and a lot of trials and failures, or but there's also work that can be done. So one of the things that my program has done is just come up with 4 different recipes, and some of those are things that other people have used, and some we just kind of made up. But we can take one given compost and go through different processes and inputs into them and come up with 4 very different teas with different microbial communities. in a pretty consistent way. So now we at least have something that we can clearly differentiate and ask questions about, well, how are these behaving on plants and in soils, and so we can look at the the growth responses, the chemical responses, and the microbial communities in them. So this is a fun area, and and we're starting a project now looking for growers who are using compost teas, by the way. People can contact us. So we want to know what growers are actually doing out there, and what are they hoping to see from compost teas? What do they need a compost tea to be able to do?
Yeah.
And how do we make something that does that?
Yeah.
And are any of them actually doing that?
Yeah.
Those things that we want them to do. And if the ones that are, why are they effective?
Yeah. It's funny you bring up compost tea, as that's what I did my master's research focused on, looking at the effects of compost tea on plant growth, less so than pathogen suppression, which is so much of the academic literature around compost tea. But I got there, going back to that idea of sort of what do our advisors and what do the higher ups at universities think of biodynamics. I was told by multiple people that they don't consider biodynamics, a biodynamic treatment in a research project, to be any different than organic. There's no sense in testing them as separate individual treatments. They're the same, and sort of brushed away the idea, was discouraged from studying things like maybe the biodynamic preparations, and instead moved towards compost tea, which, as we said, can be overhyped and all of that too. But I just think that is interesting, the directions of our research, or you have a whole research lab and trajectory of your career, and how it can be influenced by our mentors or advisors, and you went your own way. You have recently started a project involving human composting, right? Can you tell us about the new law in Washington State and what you've been working on?
Yeah, well, I guess it had been a few years since I had done anything weird enough. So I've been involved with livestock mortality composting since the late 90s, and helped to introduce, or at least popularize, livestock mortality composting in Washington in the 2000s. And a grad student did some fabulous demonstrations around the state, and we put together a extension bulletin about on-farm mortality composting. And so in 2014, this person I'd never met before called me up out of the blue and said, well, have you ever thought about whether this could be used for people? And well, yeah, it's not a big leap, at least biologically, or in terms of a physical process. Once you see what happens to a cow or a horse, I mean, a human body is very, it seems very doable, but in terms of a social construct, absolutely not. So yeah, I mean, it was kind of almost a common joke among people who compost livestock mortalities of, oh, you better be nice to me, I know what to do with you. But for somebody to really think about, how would we bring this in as something that helps to address some of the environmental and social issues that we have in our current funeral system, and do that with real honesty and a sense of just, can we realistically do this, was an amazing conversation. So yeah, I started working with Katrina Spade then, and in 2018 we did the first trials of human composting, or what's now legally called natural organic reduction. We did the first trials at WSU, which was amazing, not just in that, we did it and it was groundbreaking, but it was also pretty amazing that the university made a structure that allowed us to do that. And it took us 10 months of paperwork and research assurances to get ready to do that. And the university literally made up hoops for us to jump through. But in the end, they allowed us to do it. Yeah. And all of that process was so that they could allow us to do that. And as a research institution, support that as viable research. So it was annoying and a lot of work, but I appreciate really what that has done for just for us to be able to do that in a structured way and ask good questions and show that it works. So it's actually now legal in 7 states and counting. I've heard that there are at least 12 states that are considering it, and Washington has 3 functioning companies that are doing it. There's at least 1 in Colorado now also. So it's very exciting work, and it's something that is not just innovative, but it's something that strikes people in a way, a very substantive way of how do we reconnect with the earth? Yeah. How do we remember that we're really part of this system? Yeah. And in our last act on this earth, how do we not continue to burden it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do we give a little bit back?
Yeah. I imagine a lot of your research informed deeply these companies and their practices and their methodologies, and I would suggest strongly that your research, both in the biodynamic realm, human composting, what was that phrase you said?
Natural organic reduction.
And in natural organic reduction have destigmatized these topics.
Right.
Have made them acceptable in the research, in the university research programs, in society at large. Now that you've been here at the Biodynamic Conference for the last few days, have you had any ideas about what your next weird research question might be?
Well, so there are lots of good questions out there, and I had this idea for a while, and parts of it have been coming together, but there's a real opportunity of building a functional participatory research network among willing researchers and willing producers, where we can feed off of each other. Definitely the research questions should not all be coming from researchers. They should primarily be coming from people observing things in the field and who need answers of whether things are going to work or how they're working. And researchers need distributed network of informed data keepers. And this is happening in many different areas in agriculture too. There's this it's considered a coevolution. Yeah. I think that the biodynamic world, or biodynamic / regenerative / organic world is is a good one for that, because there are so many people doing these practices who are very observant and looking at things in a very different way, and willing to ask the questions of, how do we do this better? Is this repeatable? And I think just a real acceptance of the evolution of agriculture.
Yeah. Well, I'm personally really looking forward to that future. I've been in discussions with other members of this biodynamic movement, organizations like the Josephine Porter Institute, the Fellowship of Preparation Makers. There are existing hubs of research communities. There are researchers and farmers asking really interesting questions and really compelling questions. And I think you nailed it on the head. We need to be sharing our data. We need those keepers of the data. And we need to continue sharing with each other, not just our results and our questions, but our methodologies, and to continue building that functional community and that network. I see as a really, really important part of this next 100 years as we look back on this 100-year-old practice of biodynamics, and we look forward to the next 100 years, building a strong functional research community. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Great, this was fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And now for Garett's keynote speech as part of the closing session of the conference, The Future of Biodynamics, the Next 100 Years.
Thank you. And thanks also to all the hardworking staff, the Weston, the Social Enterprise, and of course the BDA. This has been a really incredible gathering. I've also been very deeply humbled by the remarkable wisdom of the presenters and participants at this conference. And I'm grateful for the BIPOC community present here and their willingness to share their stories and traditional ecological knowledge. We're in the presence of esteemed elders who have graciously served as our mentors, willingly ingratiating the next generation of biodynamic practitioners. They're the leaders of this movement in a time of great peril. And without several important mentors in my life, I would not be the farmer, soil scientist, or human being that I am today. After graduating from college with a biology degree, by great fortune, I found myself in Southern California at Apricot Lane Farms. And in the first month of my farming journey, we were joined by a quirky fellow with a Louisiana drawl and dressed in all white linen, and he was some purported guru of biodynamics, which at the time I knew next to nothing about. His name was Alan York. Before and after Alan's passing, we were also joined by Matthias Baker and Andrew Beatty, a sort of dream team of biodynamic consultants and prep makers. And after my first 2 immersive years of farming, when I told them I was interested in grad school, they encouraged me to continue farming if that's what I wanted to do. But I knew that Alan had read all of the technical ecology and horticulture textbooks himself, and so I ignored their advice and pursued my master's anyway. In my decision to attend grad school, I gathered inspiration from Aaron Fried Pfeiffer's biography. He was encouraged by Steiner to pursue the traditional academic training in material quantitative science and to bring it back to spiritual science. I learned how to set up experiments and long-term soil health monitoring programs, and I learned how to measure and quantify and statistically analyze my thesis results. And I voraciously read any published research on biodynamics and deepened my technical understanding of soil health, how to measure it, how to marry science and art and tell stories about the unsung heroes of healthy ecosystems that exist thanklessly underfoot. I learned about the mycorrhizal fungi that expand the root zone of plants and allow for the exchange of resources. I learned about the research of Suzanne Simard, a brilliant researcher in British Columbia who used novel methodologies to show that the extensive root mass of mother trees, as she called them, are connected to immature trees throughout the forest via mycorrhizal networks. And these mother trees share water and sugar and nutrients with the understory, often with unrelated species. She showed how electrical impulses induce biochemical signaling between trees when the forest is threatened by pests or logging. And in 2017, I finished my master's, and I've since been working on biodynamic farms, especially in the realm of research and outreach, while continuing to cut my teeth growing vegetables and raising livestock. I've been practicing biodynamics for a decade now, and every season deepening my understanding of anthroposophy and of prep work, inviting in elementals and gathering with farmers and practitioners of all levels to share and learn. Last month, I helped organize a fall prep making gathering at Troon Vineyard, where I've served as the Director of Agriculture for the last 2 years. And we were kindly joined by Marjorie, who shared with us her very practical and scientific understanding of the preps, as well as the history of the Southern Oregon Biodynamic Group. Through Marjorie, I learned of Devin Strong and the community he generously cultivated in the place that I only recently started calling home. The seeds Devin planted have sprouted again, and they were honored by the 20-some attendees of the newly revived chapter of Southern Oregon Biodynamics, or as we've started calling it, SOB. Prep-making gatherings are essential to the cultural sphere, and through educational workshops and thoughtful experimentation, we can collectively build our understanding of biodynamics scientifically. There's been relatively little peer-reviewed research published in the US, and there exists only a handful of courageous PhDs willing to risk their reputation by asking if and how the preparations impact compost or how that compost impacts plants. Why is it risky for academics to wade into the waters of biodynamics? What stigmas hold this present community back from advancing our understanding of biodynamics and ultimately of collective consciousness? The typical quantitative measures of weight and number are essential to the scientific process, but they're not the complete picture. Anyone who set foot on a mature biodynamic farm and experienced the cacophony of bird songs in the springtime or the ruckus of pollinators feeding on native plants understands that there's something distinctive and intangible about the health and vitality of biodynamic farms. And we can do surveys, and we can count these birds and insects and catalog biodiversity as a measure of ecosystem functionality, and we should. But simply demonstrating that there are more abundant and diverse bird populations is not the whole picture. I would ask why. Why do these birds prefer to nest and feed on these farms? There exists an important difference between statistical significance in research and biological significance. At this conference, we were joined by one of those brave researchers I mentioned earlier. Dr. Lynne Carpenter-Boggs is a professor of soil science at Washington State University, and in her presentation, she shared with us an incredible story of biological significance. She built compost piles side by side and applied BD preps to one of them. And over winter, as the snow fell, she took temperatures and collected samples at standardized intervals, and her results showed that the center of the biodynamic compost was just slightly warmer, only a degree or two. But it melted the snow on the top of the BD pile. And in her routine visits, she would notice the tracks of a fox. This fox would climb the BD compost pile to warm itself. While Lynne's research demonstrated only minor differences between the piles, a finding that I'm sure many BD advocates would be disappointed by, the fox knew the difference. So Lynne insightfully asked, what does the fox know? Lynne's story of the fox is not replicable or publishable. To be respected in scientific community, experiments must be measurable, repeatable, replicable. It's a requirement of peer-reviewed scientific journals. More sensitive scientific instruments and novel approaches to measuring ecological phenomenon have profoundly advanced our understanding of the natural world. Examples like using genomics for microbial community analysis, or that biochemical signaling I was talking about in Suzanne Smard's research used to identify the importance of mother trees in the forest. I believe that if we ask the right questions, and we continue to develop novel methodologies for testing these hypotheses, that we might be able to unlock a deeper understanding of more esoteric phenomenon in our relationship with the spiritual realm. Doing so would legitimize the practice of biodynamics more broadly and slowly cut away at the stigma that surrounds this research. I believe strongly that we need to create functional research networks to strengthen the impulse where it already exists and contribute validity by engaging with more traditional centers for academic research as well. We need more on-farm research where producers are asking the questions. We need the biodynamic organizations such as JPI, the Fellowship of Preparation Makers, the BDA, and regional groups to support and facilitate this work. And we need to engage the university researchers such as Lynne and John Reginold at Wazoo and Jennifer Reeve at Utah State. We need to identify a hub for this research network. A physical space, maybe, but certainly a platform for sharing ideas and data. And there should be a willingness to support, especially with funding, cross-disciplinary research. We need a repository for these novel research questions that are, again, ideally generated by biodynamic practitioners and farmers who ask what matters to the movement. I believe we need to create a mother tree of biodynamic research, a hub that shares resources with the understory and communicates the speed of electricity whenever the movement is threatened. We need to support each other and celebrate diversity, protect our only planet from the harmonic forces that threaten our very existence. I know we're all here because we believe in the healing power of biodynamics, and I believe that clearing the energies that limit our advancement of consciousness to heal the human spirit will allow us to heal our relationship with nature and with each other. Thank you.
We are happy to share this podcast from Troon Vineyard, a Demeter biodynamic and regenerative organic certified winery in Oregon's Applegate Valley. We farm like the world depends on it by growing produce in our gardens and naturally crafting authentic wines. We will be sharing these in-depth podcasts several times a month. To learn more, I encourage you to visit our website at troonvineyard.com and those of the Regenerative Organic Alliance at regenorganic.org and Demeter Biodynamics at demeter-usa.org. Thanks for sharing our voyage to regenerative agriculture with us.